NATO's Secretary General has announced the military alliance is spending billions of dollars to increase its defense capabilities. Part of the investments announced during day one of the annual summit include military aircraft and anti-drone defense systems. The first announcements come ahead of U.S. President Donald Trump's arrival in the coming hours to Ankara. He has criticized NATO members for not spending enough on defense.
Thank you very much.
Today, you will see, and the world will see, industries from North America and Europe working hand in hand, innovating together and developing next generation capabilities. These are capabilities that are really made in NATO. Not by one nation, but several, working together in close cooperation. And that's how we make our alliance more powerful. It's how we defend our 1 billion people and every inch of our territory.
Well, we have a team of correspondents covering the NATO summit for us in Turkiye, but also in Ukraine, Russia, Germany and Poland. Let's go live to our diplomatic editor, James Bays, who's leading our coverage from Ankara. James.
Folly, this issue of defence spending, it is one that Donald Trump has been angry about since his first term. This is a US president. I remember covering a summit back in 2018 in Brussels, and then he threatened to pull the US out of NATO. It is a constant threat. We've certainly seen, and you've heard the Secretary General of Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, say there's an increase of defence spending by the Allies. He says the situation has been transformed, and he's crediting Donald Trump. He said he's the first US president for 60 years to make European allies pay their fair share. But will it be enough to satisfy Donald Trump, who's now on Air Force One, arriving here in the next couple of hours? Well, let's look in more detail at the spending. Julia has been crunching the numbers.
Last year, NATO members allocated more than $1.6 trillion to defence, with the US remaining by far the biggest spender at around $980 billion. Average spending across the alliance reached 2.76% of GDP, an increase from 2024. The alliance is aiming to increase that to 5% by 2035, a demand from Washington. Between 2021 and 2025, the US sold 58% of major arms imports to NATO members.
Well, one of the countries that really has increased its defence spending is Germany. They've had a new budget recently. As I was going to tell you something about Germany, will in a moment, but let's listen to the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, who is speaking right now.
No team wins because of one brilliant player. We need a goalkeeper, you need the defenders, the midfielders, the strikers. And yes, everyone notices the player who scores the winning goal. But behind every successful player and team out on the pitch are many others on the bench and behind the scenes. The coaches, the trainers, the analysts, the people making sure everything works. Everyone matters, no one wins alone. NATO is much the same. It takes a whole team to deter and defend most effectively. Our political leaders set the direction. Our armed forces are on the pitch every single day. And you, our defense industry, provide the strength behind the team. The equipment, the innovation, the production capacity. To have power, resilience and endurance, we all need to be fully engaged in the game. Working together for our shared security. You need us at NATO to tell you what our militaries need. That is the demand. And we need you to turn those requirements into real capabilities. That is the supply. That is why it is so crucial that we continue to build cooperation between NATO and industry. I have seen it grow and developed since I took over in 2024. I visited factories and facilities across the alliance, including here in Turkey. I've spoken with company leaders, engineers and workers on the factory floor. I've seen the innovation. I've seen the opportunity. And I see our partnership in action right here at this forum. This is what teamwork looks like. And this is a team that knows how to score. Last year at the NATO summit in The Hague, allies made important commitments to invest 5% of GDP in defense, to accelerate production and to speed up innovation. 1 year later, we can already see the results. Last year alone, European allies and Canada spent nearly 20% more on defense than the year before. An extra $139 billion. Looking at 2025 and 2026 together, it is an increase, again, Canada and the Europeans, of $258 billion, more than $250 billion. And that's just the additional investment. So basically, one thing is clear. The money is there, and much more is coming. But this cash must be put to work. It needs to purchase capabilities to actually deter and defend. Governments and the defense industry are laying the path by investing in expanding defense production. Over the last year alone, we have seen $37 billion invested in just boosting our defense industrial base itself. Again, think about this number, 37 billion to boost our defense industrial base. So larger factories, new production lines, more capacity. In fact, there is enough additional production space to cover more than 2,000 football pitches. And just this morning at the forum, substantial new contracts were signed and more big announcements were made. Altogether worth tens of billions of dollars and growing. That means more air defense systems and strike capabilities, more satellite communications, more ammunition, more drones and counter-drone systems, and increased resilience and preparedness. According to our projections, by next year, the alliance will have the capacity to produce around 4 million artillery shells annually. Almost twice as many as last year. That's scale. So yes, we have made real progress. We are moving in the right direction. The strategy is clear. But the match is far from over. And to win it, we need all team members to pull their weight. Do more, faster, together. We don't have the luxury of time. We need capabilities now to ensure we remain ready. The security situation demands it. Russia. Russia is pouring almost half of its national budget into its war machine. Can you imagine? Almost 50% of what Russia spends is put into the war machine. Its defense industry is working around the clock. And not only the defense industry, also the rest of the industrial base in Russia is supporting the war effort. China continues to modernize its armed forces and expand its nuclear capabilities without transparency. North Korea continues to expand its nuclear program and supply Russia. And while recent US action has significantly degraded Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, we must remain vigilant. These countries are increasingly working together. And that should concern us all. Because I assure you, they do not have our best interests in mind. So that's what we are up against. That's the reality we face. To meet the challenge, We need a transatlantic defense industrial revolution. The hum of machinery must become a roar. Now, that sounds dramatic, but it can be done. Governments have their role to play. They must continue placing long-term orders and signing contracts. Today is an excellent example of that kind of contracts we need to put on the table. More of that, please. We need a bonfire of red tape in our procurement and in our cross-border regulation. Both government and industry must continue investing in production capacity. Governments must also create the conditions for industry to expand and cooperate. Factories need reliable energy, electricity and fuel. They need secure supply chains. And above all, they need skilled people. Engineers, technicians, innovators. At the same time, industry across all of the nations represented here must be ready to take more risk. The demand is there and you know it. We are being much more open about what we need. At the summit, we are releasing publicly for the first time a consolidated demand signal outlining our requirements. We will help ensure you know the demand and understand it. And you also know the market is growing. Allies will continue to invest in defense. This is not an anomaly, this is a trend. Lastly, no single nation and no single industry can power an industrial revolution alone. But the good news is that we don't have to, because we have NATO. We combine the assets, the technologies and the industries of 32 countries across Europe and North America. That's incredibly powerful. We have an unequaled pool of talent, creativity and expertise out there. And many are right here in this room today. And we are even stronger when we work together with our partners. With Ukraine, of course, which continues to innovate at incredible speed. It now boasts an unparalleled drone ecosystem. And we are creating opportunities for more industrial cooperation and co-production with Ukraine. We must seize this opportunity. We are also building industrial cooperation with the European Union and countries in the Indo-Pacific. I've seen the Japanese defense minister and others here in this room today. Welcome. Because when we combine our efforts, we produce more, we innovate faster, and we strengthen all our security. So today, we are on the cusp of the transatlantic defense industrial revolution. I'm asking you to take a leap and show our people that we are ready and capable to protect them anywhere at any time. And show Russia and all those watching today that the transatlantic defense industrial base is mobilizing with purpose. Not in anger, but for our collective security. So let me finish where I started. Winning teams prepare. They train, they invest, they build trust, and they keep improving. That's exactly what we must continue to do. The partnership between NATO and industry is the winning one. So now, let's deliver even more, even faster, and together. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
The NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte speaking there here in Ankara, a different part of Ankara from where I am, a number of different venues. He's at the Defence Investment Forum, saying there's been real progress on NATO spending. He said they were moving in the right direction. That forum is where they're bringing together the arms industry along with NATO allies to try and turn the promises by NATO allies on spending into actual weapons that can be used on the battlefield. Let's now be joined by Murat, Aslan, a defence analyst. He's actually there at the forum. Thank you very much for joining us, Murat. More spending by NATO allies, that's definitely true. But is it going to be enough to satisfy Donald Trump? Because you heard the Secretary General there say that all team members need to pull together. Well, if you look at some members of NATO, including some of those that have the largest armies, the UK and France, their figures don't look that impressive, do they?
Problem var.
We seem to have lost Murat. We'll come back to him in a moment. But talking of team members pulling their weight, one that perhaps you would say has pulled its weight is Germany, where there's been a very big investment in defence. Dominic Kane is our Berlin correspondent. A new budget there in Germany. What do the German public make of all of this?
Well, when they look at the sorts of figures that the Chancellor Friedrich Merz and his Vice-Chancellor Lars Klingbeil have come out with in recent days, they say, so you want defence-related expenditure to be around $900 billion by 2030. OK, how will that be financed? And when they see the sort of taxation that is being proposed by the government, there is a degree of, if not resentment, serious concern, because this is a government that is very, very deeply unpopular in opinion polls, and many people wonder, is this the right way? There is a minority in this country that is bitterly opposed to the sorts of policies insofar as Ukraine is concerned that this government and previous governments since the war in Ukraine began have developed. The idea of consistent, constant aid to the government in Kyiv is something that a large minority of people really don't like. So there are those who say, yes, we need to do what the government is doing, but there are others who are becoming increasingly loud, saying, no, maybe now is the time for some sort of overture to bring an end to the sorts of situation in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and that maybe we don't need to be spending so much money on defence. As I say, around $900 billion worth is planned in defence-related expenditure by 2030.
Dominic Kane in Berlin. Well, from Germany, let's move to Poland, which is on a heightened state of alert. Milena Veselinovic is there for us. Milena, you are close to what NATO considers its front line, Russian territory and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. Tell us about the situation there.
That's right, James. I'm at one of only 2 border crossings out of 4 that are currently open between Poland and the Russian region of Kaliningrad. And such are the sensitivities between these 2 nations, Russia and Poland, that we're not actually allowed to point our camera towards Russia, because here really we are, and it feels that way, on the front line of NATO's eastern border. The war in Ukraine doesn't feel theoretical. That's because Poland has been on the receiving end of what many in Europe call hybrid warfare. Those are things like cyber attacks, covert information, disinformation, but there are also concerns about more concrete attacks potentially in the future on Polish soil. And for that reason, this country has been beefing up its army, recruiting more and more people, really taking it seriously, spending more on defense than they spend on things like health and education, for example. So we've traveled across Poland to really get a sense from people about how seriously they're taking this threat from Russia. Take a listen.
It's a family day out with a twist. Young and old inspecting Polish military equipment. This fair in the town of Gryźliny in northeastern Poland comes with a slice of combat readiness. A sign of the heightened state of alert Poland has lived under since Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighbour Ukraine.
Over here you've got kids going down the slides, and this children's play area is directly facing tanks from the Polish army. And these kinds of events, bringing together the military and civilians, are becoming more and more common here in Poland.
They're also a recruitment tool, part of a wider push to strengthen Poland's armed forces. In a country that spends a larger share of its GDP on defence than any other NATO member.
We certainly should arm ourselves, let's put it that way. These days, with what's happening in the east, well, we all know, so a militarised state is a powerful state.
Considering what they are doing behind our border right now, there is a threat.
Well, for me, they shouldn't be here. For me, they should be at the border, right? Standing and waiting.
This is what fuels concern. The damage was caused when around 20 drones that NATO said were Russian entered Polish airspace last September. Moscow denies responsibility. But just days ago, a source close to Poland's president said the US had warned that Russia could stage an armed provocation on Polish soil to test NATO's resolve. A resolve that US troops are here to reinforce, celebrating Independence Day with their Polish allies near their base in the city of Poznan.
The security of Europe and North America is indivisible.
Yet in May, American President Donald Trump cancelled a planned deployment of 4,000 soldiers to Poland before reversing the decision just days later, citing his relationship with the Polish president Karol Nawrocki.
Well, the American soldiers are showing off their hardware, and right alongside them is the Polish military equipment. Polish soldiers are there too, and it's a symbolic show of unity among NATO allies. But it doesn't erase the growing concern about whether Europe can still rely on America for its security.
Poland is not leaving anything to chance. Here, the war in Ukraine feels uncomfortably close. Milena Veselinovic, Al Jazeera, northeastern Poland.
Well, we're joined again, I hope, by our analyst Murat Aslan, a defence analyst. There are some communication problems in this city because of the tight security with all of these delegations. Each of the 32 countries has brought leaders, defence ministers and foreign ministers, and some of them are now arriving here. And that means jammers at work, which sometimes interfere with our communications. And Murat Aslan is inside that defence industry forum. I hope you can hear me now, Murat. You heard the NATO Secretary General talking about more spending by NATO allies. But will it be enough to satisfy Donald Trump? Because if you look at the figures, there are big countries like France and the UK, and their figures still aren't very impressive.
Thanks for having me, James. Yes, there's a great electronic suppression in here for security measures. For defense spending, Rutte clearly announced that there will be an increase and the new systems should be acquired and will be acquired is announced. That means NATO as an alliance, overall alliance, will start procuring assets to NATO as organic instruments, organic weapons and other systems. And that's a good step and also a challenging step. A good step because NATO will have organic capabilities. On the other hand, they are from the European defense industry companies. That means the United States will somehow criticize such sorts of procurements. On the other hand, he pushes all states to increase their defense spending. We are expecting 3.5 in the coming years, though. I think the essential question is not the amount, but the flow of this money into the pockets of which companies, like the ones in the United States or in Europe. So the situation right now is a bit mixed and complicated, because I think the high-level meeting summit will discuss exactly what sort of pie they will have.
Murat, when it comes to your own country, the host country, Turkiye, there's something President Erdogan clearly wants. He wants it from the US, and it's a long-running saga, is it not? It's those F-35s.
Well, Turkey is very clear in terms of defense spending, or let me say 3 C's. That means cash, capabilities, and also contribution. Turkey wants NATO a resilient and also durable security architecture covering the overall Europe. And in the meantime, Turkey wants to contribute and also wants to enjoy the security guarantees of NATO, because there's a harsh debate right now regarding the EU security, European security, and NATO security. So Turkey does not want to see a clear divergence from the roots of this security understanding, and wants to have NATO as the one covering the overall system.
Murat, Aslan, thank you very much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Well, on the agenda for this NATO summit, 2 wars are going to be mentioned. The war and that shaky peace with regard to the US and Iran, and of course the war in Ukraine, where European allies believe that there has been a tide turn. The Ukrainians much stronger than they were, putting Russia under real pressure, reaching Moscow, causing real problems in Russian-controlled Crimea. And they're hoping that Donald Trump will put fresh pressure on President Putin to start negotiations that are on reasonable terms for Ukraine. President Trump, who's on his way here, speaking before he got on Air Force One, was playing up the prospects of peace.
President Putin wants it to end. I will tell you that very strongly. What a good call. And President Zelensky actually wants it to end now. And we're going to be going to NATO, and we're going to be talking about it. And I think we're going to get it. I think we're going to get it ended.
Well, President Zelensky is one of the invited guests who will be here at the NATO summit. Audrey MacAlpine is in Kyiv. Audrey, he's coming here. What does he want?
Well, President Zelensky, James, will have a few points that he would like to make. At the top of his priorities list will be air defense. That will be underscored by these 2 large-scale attacks that we saw in Ukraine over the past week that left 55 people dead here in the capital. And of those attacks, especially this most recent attack, of all the ballistic missiles that were fired by Russia into Ukraine, not a single one was intercepted. So Zelensky will be making the case that he is in need, Ukraine is in need of those Patriot air defensive missiles in order to combat those attacks. But President Zelensky, I believe, will also have another point that he'll be wanting to make, which will be that Ukraine, in his eyes, is no longer on the back foot. He'll be wanting to underscore its recent successes with its long-range strikes into Russia that have been crippling its oil industry. And he'll also be wanting to paint these escalating Russian attacks on Kyiv and other cities around Ukraine as a response to that success that Ukraine has had with those long-range drone strikes. So this is a moment for Zelensky to portray Ukraine as having the upper hand, to use that momentum to gain support from its allies, as well as to really use that momentum, as Zelensky has said, to eventually push Russian President Vladimir Putin back to the negotiating table.
Thank you very much, Audrey MacAlpine there in Kyiv. Well, let's take the view now from Moscow. Yulia Shapovalova is with me now in Moscow. Yulia, tell me, how is this NATO summit being seen in Moscow? Is this being seen, following the comments of President Trump, as an opportunity for peace, or is this seen as a moment of danger?
Well, absolutely. Actually, Russia
obviously has certain concerns with this NATO summit, and they're related to NATO's declaration of Moscow a long-term threat to Euro-Atlantic security, as well as to the alliance's plan to provide Ukraine with a large-scale package of military assistance for this and next years in the amount of 140 billion euros. And Russia hears the signals from there, all the official discussions and publications, and they are discussing scenarios of a possible direct military clash, NATO countries' defense budget increase, as well as hypothetical risks of Kyiv's request for nuclear weapons. So the Russian side believes that these steps do not contribute to peace, and Western obligations are designed to support the conflict in Ukraine. Russia is going to closely follow US President Donald Trump statements to, regarding NATO's future and his current position towards Russia. He's known for his unpredictability, so to speak, and on the eve of the summit, he continued to express dissatisfaction with European allies, and any conflicting opinions and views within the bloc play into Moscow's hands. And prior to this summit, Putin and Donald Trump had a telephone conversation, and it took place on July the 4th, and it hadn't been actually the first time when Putin and Trump spoke before negotiations between the States and Ukraine. And last autumn, Putin also spoke to Trump right before his talks with Zelensky. And back then, the Ukrainian president was supposed to ask the US to supply Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles. And now we know that they're going to meet again. And the outcome of this meeting will, of course, can obviously can determine the further course of the conflict.
Yulia, thank you very much for that. Well, we are obviously waiting here at the NATO summit to see all of the leaders arrive. Very tight security here, because when you get one of these NATO meetings, you get all the foreign ministers, all the defence ministers, all the leaders from 32 countries. In fact, in terms of leaders, there are 33, because in the Czech Republic, the president and prime minister are of opposing parties, and they couldn't decide who was coming, so they've both come with rival delegations. We'll be watching that, but also watching very closely for the arrival in the next couple of hours of President Donald Trump on Air Force One, as I say, arriving here relatively soon, Folly.
Just looking, James, at live pictures of Air Force One landing right now as we speak in Ankara, the US president arriving for the NATO summit there. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on the developments there out of Ankara with you throughout the day, today and tomorrow on Al Jazeera. James Bays, our diplomatic editor.